Peace, everybody. What's up? Welcome to Randomly Selected, powered by the Silver Room. My name is Mario. Today, we have a very special guest, Miss Helen Shiller. Helen Shiller is a former alderman in the Uptown neighborhood here in Chicago. She is a G in the highest order. Today, we talk to her about her beginnings and the experience of growing up, and how a moment with her dad, watching the McCarthy trials, Google that, kids, set her on the path to be this amazing political activist. And we get to hear how her activism actually started. This is a good one today, y'all. It's Helen Shiller on Randomly Selected.
My parents were both immigrants.
Mm-hmm.
My mother came when she was with her family, when she was just 6.5, from what's now Belarus. It was actually then Poland, but literally, in her 6.5 years, she had 2 younger sisters. When my mother was born, she has a Russian passport. When her next sister was born, she had a German passport.
Wow.
And when the next sister was born, birth certificate, the next sister was born, she had a Polish birth certificate.
Wow.
So she always talked about, when we said, "Where were you from?" to my mom, she would say, "From Poland, but we weren't citizens." Because, they were Jewish, and they never really felt that they were part of the citizens. My father came here the same year as my mother did, but he came from Latvia. He was 12 years old. He came by himself. In order to come by himself, he had to pretend to be 16. He looked older than he was, so he was able to pass for 16, but his entire life, legally in the States, he was 4 years older than he really was.
Wow.
Which shaped a lot of his life, especially many years later when the Holocaust occurred and his entire family, he thought, was killed in Latvia. He tried to join the army here, and they wouldn't accept him because they said he was too old.
Oh, wow.
So, which I think made him feel very guilty. But he was angry. The whole experience was one that left him somewhat angry and bereft. So those are my parents. And they were always involved in progressive causes during my mother was a nurse. She was involved in organizing when she was first became a nurse. In the hospitals in New York. My dad was self-educated, essentially, ended up being a chemist, a chemical engineer. He taught for a short while at NYU. I have no idea how he managed to do that, because I'm sure he didn't have any kind of diplomas. And he and then when he was rejected to join the Army in the early 40s, he decided to start his own business, because all of the major chemical companies that he was aware of in New York, he was confident were somehow supporting the Nazi cause. So he decided he would start his own business, and he made paints, inks, and lacquers for textiles. That was what he did. At a small factory. So I was born in Brooklyn. We lived in Queens for several years, and we moved when I was 4.5 to Long Island. And we're in our house in Long Island. My dad keeps me home from school. I'm in kindergarten. And he sits me down in front of the TV, which is, this huge box sitting on the floor, one of the early TVs. And he says, "I know you're not going to remember why we're here, but I'm having you here to watch the House on American Activities hearings on the McCarthy Army hearings."
Wow.
He says, "I know you're not going to remember what this is about. You may not even get it today, but you're going to remember you were here. And I want you to remember one thing from this activity today, and that is that fascism is something you always have to fight." So that's, in essence, the start of my sort of consciousness, if you will. My mother, in the early 50s, my dad... my parents, who were still living in Queens, received a knock on the door from the FBI. Apparently, during the 40s, another chemist had asked him for several months if he could use his lab. His lab was literally the size of the table we're sitting at now, and with a few shelves that just had chemicals on it, all related to his activities making paints, inks, and lacquers for textiles. This guy asked him if he could occasionally work in his lab, and he said sure. He was doing some special projects. It turns out this guy was one of the people that was arrested with the Rosenbergs.
Whoa.
So they were investigating my dad. So they came to our house. My dad almost immediately had a heart attack, and they left us alone. He really had that was whatever. Yeah. So my mother's response was immediately, in our apartment in Queens, it was like a sunken living room.
Yeah.
She immediately took all of her books and threw them into this sunken living room and literally threw all of them away except for one or two. And one of the books that she didn't throw away, that later on, after we moved, became the first chapter book I read, was a book called Freedom Road by Howard Fast, which is entirely about Reconstruction. So between those two things, I kind of formed my own opinion about stuff. And when I was 18, the movie Point of Order came out, so that I saw it because I remembered my dad sitting me down in front of the hearings and brought all that together. And then I went away to college, and he was very disturbed that I was not more involved in the anti-war movement, told me, you have to be involved. We had a whole conversation. He told me about his aspirations for the world and how this was very long term, that the things that he said, my hope and expectations for the world is that everyone ultimately can live in a world where they have their needs taken care of and they contribute what they can and they receive what they need. He said, but that won't happen until that's happening everywhere. So that's a really long thing, and you need to be a part of that. And that really stuck with me. And he said, forget all the labels that people put on. That's the aspirations. You have to find a way to do that. So I went back to college and started, I found out I'd been wearing, when I was in school, I made a lot of clothing for myself and then other people because they asked me for it. So I was able to sew. So I go back and there's a play being put on called The Hostage by Brendan Behan being
this
put
is
on.
At UW-Madison,
yes.
right?
So go back to Madison. I'm now in my sophomore year. This was the summer between my freshman and sophomore year. And there's a play that the Committee to End War in Vietnam is putting on called The Hostage. And I say, okay, I can do costumes. So I go and they say, sure. And that movie for me, that play for me is really a moral dilemma play. It's a play about moral dilemmas. It's about a group of people who are raggedy tag revolutionary IRA folks who have kidnapped a British soldier because there is an IRA soldier in London who's about to be executed, and so or in Bristol somewhere, and they have this guy as a hostage in a whorehouse, and they're like this is the play, and they're the whole play is about a debate about what they're really going to do with this guy because they're pretty sure they're not going to convince anyone in Britain not to kill the other guy.
Right. So
it's a whole thing about moral dilemma. These are just regular folks struggling for some kind of independence and recognition of who they are. So those are really probably some of the most impactful things that led me to the next thing, which was the following year, there was a Dow Chemical who was making napalm in Vietnam was coming to campus to recruit people to work for them. And so there were a group of us. There was a group of people who were planning on doing a picket. And so there was another group of us that went to the meeting and said, well, we think that you should do the picket, but we think a bunch of us should sit in. We think that there's a supportive picket would be good, but we should sit in. And there's a big, huge argument about it. And finally, at the end of the meeting, a few of us say, okay, everyone who wants to join us in the picket, walk to the side of the room. So about 100 people do, and we say, cool, we're going there. We're looking for your support outside. So the next day, I get to Bascom Hill, which is the big hill that all the initially, it's expanded a lot, but where a lot of the buildings are, school buildings surrounding it. We're at the bottom of the hill, and there's only like 15 of us there. And I'm like, okay, to myself. My dad said, you better get involved, but you better never get arrested. My mom said, I don't care what you do, but don't ever get kicked out of school. And I'm sitting there thinking, whatever I'm about to do, either one of those things can happen.
Right.
So it was my moment of truth, if you will. It was the moment at which I actually made a decision about how I was going to lead the rest of my life. And I've honored it every year since then. And ironically, that this year is going to, on the day in which we're launching the book, is the 55th anniversary of the day in which I honored that. So that's really cool. I don't think that Haymarket, as the publishers, knew it at the time that was that date. But when they gave me the date, I'm like, yes. That's perfect.
I'm sure if they would have known.
Well, I don't know, because the actual date of the demonstration was October 18th. But I've always, because the decision we made was October 17th, I've always honored October 17th.
Yeah.
So they when I told the story, I can't even remember how I told it in the book, but I know it's in the book. Anyway, so that's really and then following year, I was part of a delegation of white students who were sponsored by, mostly white students. There was one Puerto Rican student who were sponsored by SDS to go to Cuba, really kind of challenging, sort of in-your-face challenging, as we thought of it, the U.S. government, because we were following the same path that a group of leading members of the Black Panther Party from the East and West Coast had attempted to go to Cuba, and when they were in Mexico City, they were kidnapped basically by U.S. intelligence agencies and sent to opposite coasts when they were, after being held for incognito, then sent back to opposite coasts from which they came. So this was kind of a challenge to that, as I recall.
Was that meeting, or that opportunity to be around the Black Panther Party, how much influence did that play on you? So
at that point, it was just in response to what had happened to them. We didn't go with them. This had happened before that. After I returned from Cuba, a few months later, the Black students at Madison organized a student strike demanding African American studies at the school, and several of us were very involved in that. I was very involved in that. We decided that our job was to get other students, predominantly white students, the campus was, to support the strike. So we literally there were teams of us, and we would go into classrooms, take over the classroom. Somebody would stand outside as security, yell when the security came, and then, but in the meanwhile, we take over a class and tell them about the strike, and then run to the next room and keep doing that until we had to leave the building. So at the end of that year, I was graduating, and some friends, actually Brendan's dad, recruited me to go to Racine, where he had joined two other people who were organizing there. There were also people organizing from Madison at the same time in Milwaukee and in Waukegan, Illinois. And we really, initially they were organized, the idea was to organize in the factories. We decided by the end of the summer, Mark and I, that we were going to be organized. We were going to go organize youth. And then we started... We actually brought a delegation of young people to Chicago, to the Federal Building, where Fred Hampton was holding a rally around the Chicago 8 when Bobby Seale was still, when he'd been bound, but he was still part of, before it became the Chicago 7. Right. And we began to sell Black Panther Party papers in Racine, where we were getting them from what was the National Committee to Combat Fascism in Milwaukee. But just before Fred was killed, he suspended all the NCAA, National Committee to Combat, the National Committees to Combat Fascism, and locally, which included theirs, so that after when he was killed, we were actually in Racine debating whether we were going to stay there. Mark and I were kind of arguing. We weren't sure if we were going to stay in Racine. We wake up to hear that he had been killed. We decide, okay, we kind of rededicated ourselves to stay there, and we knew that we had to find Black leadership to work under, because we didn't know what was happening with Milwaukee. Right. But when we came, so we did that. So that was sort of the commitment really for the rest of my life, basically. And we came to Chicago for the funeral, connected with Slim Coleman and Kathy Archibald, who then connected us with members of the Rockford chapter of the Black Panther Party, who then provided us with papers that we sold weekly, and occasionally came at least once a month to do political education with us. And sometimes we went there. So that's what we continued to do until 1972, when Slim recruited me and then everyone else to come to Chicago.
In this segment, we talk about Operation Push. Shout out Johnny Jackson. What's up, brother? We also talk about how Operation Push helped the North and South Sides to really start cross-pollination and what drew Helen to the neighborhood of Uptown, one of my favorite neighborhoods. We also talk about how she handles the labels and narratives that have been put on her forever and how she controls the narrative. More with Helen Shiller.
So, yes. So Uptown, we were Slim and Bobby Rush. Slim came to Racine, but he and Bobby went to East St. Louis, as I understand, or St. Louis. There was a group of folks in St. Louis who were working with the Black Panther Party in East St. Louis, students. So there was the core people in Chicago. They came to recruit us from Racine, and then this other core people from St. Louis to come to Chicago to join the fledgling, what they were creating, the Intercommunal Survival Committee. Now, the Intercommunal Survival Committee was a dedicated cadre of white people working to organize white people in the white community to get white people to join the Black-led struggle for liberation. And Uptown was our focus, in large measure because it had the largest concentration of poor white people probably in the nation, but certainly in the city. And there was a history in Uptown. In the mid-'60s, a group called Join, which was basically members of SDS who were students, had come to Uptown to organize, and out of that grew or developed among some of the people they organized, the Young Patriots, which was a group of it was basically a local gang of white kids who decided that, mostly white men, but not entirely, who decided that they were going to become political, just similarly as what Chacha Jimenez had done in Lincoln Park with regards to the Young Lords. Fred Hampton had this notion of a rainbow coalition, and had gone to first, as I understand it, to Chacha, and then his field secretary Bobby Lee was organizing and was on the north side, and he went to Uptown and organized all the Young Patriots to join this rainbow coalition. They were not really functioning by the time we came in '72. It was the summer, and I came in July of '72. Everyone else started coming in August, and then in January, the rest of the folks from Racine came. And so we functioned based on the programs of the Black Panther Party. We set up home distribution routes of the Black Panther paper in Uptown. We went door to door, and in October, on October 12th of 1972, we had a rally for community control and end of police brutality and community control of police. Getting the name off wrong, at the Aragon Theater, where we gave away 3,000 bags of groceries, and Bobby Rush was the keynote speaker, and we mobilized and organized everyone we could, and the majority of whom were white, largely Southern people, and we had no idea what was going to happen, but it turned out to be, but police misconduct is a commonality throughout the city, and it was then as well. And the Young Patriots they'd marched earlier, several years earlier, on the old Somerville station, and almost everywhere where there's activity, Young Lords and their interaction with the commander of the 18th District, the Young Patriots with their interaction with the 20th District, all of these, everyone they interacted with, every group of police they interacted with who were engaged in misconduct that affected each of them were then later to be corrupt and actually were, big scandals in both cases. Right. So this was a real dynamic for folks, and obviously for the Black Panther Party as well, and in the Black community as well. So it was something that people really had in common, and it turned out to be a very effective way to start talking about what we had in common. Meanwhile, we did many different survival programs. We had a Breakfast of Children program. We had a free clothing program. We advocated for people and took them to all sorts of free health clinics. We worked on basically programs that related to every point in the 10-point platform and program. And we had a home distribution route where we stopped, we talked to people, we knocked on every door. Sometimes, many times, even when people slammed the doors in our face. People got interested in the paper largely because they were interested in the programs and even read it. occasionally.
Right.
And so out of that, we developed a whole series of so that was sort of why we ended up in Uptown. People in Uptown were as likely to go home to wherever they were from, largely the South, but sometimes it was just Southern Illinois, or even the far South side of Chicago, more likely to do that than they were to go downtown. It really was its own. It was also at that time in the early 70s, I think, only one of several. It was the only other place other than Hyde Park, which was more middle class, where there were census tracts that were not just black or white, but were actually had a variety of people. Uptown in 1972 had, as I said, the largest concentration of poor white people in the city, had the largest concentration of Native Americans outside of any reservation in the country, had still living there, mostly elderly or becoming elderly, Japanese people who'd been interned in California had come to Chicago. Many of them came through Uptown or Lakeview and ended up in different parts of the city, but there was still a core of people there. It was there were interracial couples who didn't have a lot of money. Almost always came to Uptown because they could at least live there, even though it wasn't to say it was still a divided community, block by block. But that's where a lot of people were. Because they could find a place to live in an apartment and survive and not be, restricted by the segregation, the extreme segregation in other parts of the city. There was the northern part of Lakeview and the southern, very, very southern end tip of Uptown had become very heavily Puerto Rican as the Puerto Rican community was moved from Clark and Division, and then through Lincoln Park, and now many folks were up on the north side, further north, but also moving now into Westtown and Humboldt Park. So it was a very diverse area with people. There were these high-rises, HUD high-rises that had been built, and people were literally living in there from every continent in the country. So it was, but also from places where they had been displaced. So even though people might not want to talk to each other, the one thing that everyone had in common was that they had been displaced from somewhere else and they didn't want to be displaced anymore.
Yeah. I know there are a couple of things because I want to get as much of this in as I can with you while I got you here. Someone said of you that you are, quote, committed to liberal causes and destroying all within her path. True?
I don't know what that means. I'm committed to people being able to have that people's day-to-day struggle to survive is acknowledged and recognized, and people aren't invisible, but they're seen, and that collectively we find a way in which we can, each of us can find the way in which to not only contribute to a better quality of life, but get the strength to be able to make the changes that make this a much more just and fair world. And that's what I'm committed to. I've always experienced people trying to label me and redefine that for me, and I won't accept that. I won't accept the labels, and I also won't accept the narrative. It's my narrative. And it's a narrative of many people. And in 1975, we started Keep Strong magazine. Right. And the goal of Keep Strong magazine was to create a vehicle that allowed people to see themselves reflected, their day-to-day struggle to survive reflected, and to see that other people have similar struggles, so that together we can find some common solutions and answers, but that those don't come easy. And so everything that we did in the 70s and my interaction and the method of work that I really learned from the work we did largely, and the leadership of the Black Panther Party, which I learned a great deal from, became a very big part of why I was able to navigate the Chicago City Council in the decade later, or the 2 decades later. It is, I think that you have to, politics is cynical, politics is superficial, It doesn't have to be, and I always found myself well, maybe it does have to be. That's an argument I always have with Harold Washington about politics. He loved being a politician, and I hated politics, so we had interesting conversations.
Right.
And I respected where he was coming from, because truth be told, we had the same goals in mind. We just came from different places. And he enjoyed that game much more than I did. But because he was better at it, probably. Right. But for me, the issue was solving real problems, and how do you do that? And I came to believe strongly that the only way to really solve a problem is to identify its most serious manifestation, and then look at who's most impacted by it. Most often, that's people with the fewest resources. Not always. Really, you have to look at the situation, not come with preconceived notions, and then adopt solutions that get at the heart of the matter and the people most affected, but also take in consideration the rings around that, so that you want to be aware of collateral impacts so you can avoid the negative ones whenever possible, and make sure that there are solutions that really are solutions. So to me, that's the key. So whatever you want to call it, you can call it, but that's the key. And there are people that think that, so the common thing was that developers used to say, and my opposition always said, she just wants to control people's lives. And it was clearly just the opposite. My concern was to give people the tools that they needed in order to be able to control their own lives. And to do that, then you had to, effectively, you needed some collective action to make changes. But those are your choices. Right. And together we figure out the best way to proceed. And leadership's job, to whatever extent there is leaders, there's always some leaders involved, that the most effective leadership is to hear what that is, to understand what the concerns are, to see where you need to go, where people need to go, and figure out how to work with people to get there.
Helen talks about her views on the current mayoral administration here in Chicago. We talked to her about her tenure in the city council and what was it like working for the great Mayor Harold Washington, and being in the Washington administration post the Doley Act 29. More with Helen Shiller here on Randomly Selected.
I don't know that I can answer that question. I think that some of, people act out of their past experience, and their own issues. And I'm sure therein lies the answer to your question. But I do think that on the things that we disagree with the most really comes down to our approach. I think that you deal with issues that are underlying issues that result in the kind of destabilization that leads to crime and violence, by really addressing the core basis for that and creating stable communities and allowing people to really have the opportunity to grow and develop. And I think if you have that approach, you come out with a different set of things to do than if you have the approach that's much more judgmental. And I think that the current administration last few administrations, well, actually all but Harold Washington's administration, have been very judgmental. What he did, which was different, was really, he started from a place of just truly believing in people and looking at what does it take to unleash people's energy and power and creative possibilities. He always talked about the importance of education, but knowing how much. I remember his speeches. I remember a speech where he was at Jones Commercial High School. I think it might have been a press conference. I was covering it for All Chicago City News, and he was talking about the difference it would make the day he was elected for children in the public schools, because he knew that would mean that that the kids saw a possibility that they hadn't realized before. So to know that you're seen, to know that you can become anything you want, is something that we need to re-embed in the DNA of young people, or make sure it continues to be there, as just one example. But he was so committed to that in everything that he did, so that when we talked about issues with the police for the first time in my existence in Chicago, he was really supportive of the efforts of communities to be able to redefine the relationship to the police, even though he was very clear he didn't have control over the police. It was when there was a lot of corruption. Burge was was active. He wasn't the only one. Harold was aware of that, struggling with doing it. I remember our conversations where he said, "I don't have control over the police." But even with the African American Patrolmen's League, who were so important in that period of time, they were able to provide security for him much more effectively than impacting the structure because it was so institutional. So he was clear there had to be these institutional changes, but that's where he came from. And he came from a point of view, in my view, of being non-judgmental about people's individual choices, but focused on what it took to create different opportunities so people can make better choices.
So is it just, and I definitely want to speak on Harold Washington a little bit more, but is it just, I guess you said it, it's just how she works.
I think that there's kind of, there's multiple kinds of people, but on two ends of the sort of the spectrum of how people respond to things, there is, on one end of the spectrum is judgmentalism, and on, just judging everything that coming from the point of view of judging, and on the other end of this perspective is coming from the point of view of possibilities, and creating the environment that allows people to be able to develop themselves. And I think that that's what we're talking about. There's that divide, and there's a lot of people that move toward. I mean, we're kind of taught to move towards being judgmental. We always want to. We know how we feel. We know what our frustrations are. We approach it very individualistically, more so today than like when I was young and growing up. And some of that is the politics of our lives. It used to be. I grew up in an environment where the purpose of government was to fill in where the economy wasn't working for people, or where you weren't, and not always very perfectly, but at least there was a concept. The government had a responsibility to everyday people, and some of that was survival. They didn't want revolution, so they supported unions, right? Whatever.
Right.
But they created ways in which people, they created the whole infrastructure stuff during the 30s, what to do to get people out of the Depression. But it was a government responsibility. Today, but then we had. There was began to be a backlash to the civil rights movement under Nixon, but especially under Reagan, who was out front. This is me first. We're going to do the me first generation and the great white majority, or silent majority, which really meant white majority. And the complete redefinition that underlying was based on race and a racial approach, but really was, insisted that the people who'd been invisible were people that somehow were being hurt by the gains of the civil rights movement. So it was clearly a racial divide that was really couched in this rhetoric of it's time for it to be, we have to do for ourselves. And it was really, there was a me first movement. That's really what it was. And that's the consequences, I think, of everything that's been done since then. And that reactionary response was well funded, and has been a very prolonged process of very conservative and right-wing folks with a lot of money taking control of all the local state legislatures and redefining our national politics. And and there hasn't really been a very effective response because the middle has been wishy-washy about all of that, and so we're really in a kind of difficult situation right now.
I want to ask, your tenure in the city council was during Mayor Washington's second term?
When I was first elected, I was. When I ran in 1987. I swore I'd never do it again from the earlier times I'd run, and Harold recruited me to run to be his 26th vote.
What was it like working in his administration? From the outside, I imagine that it was contentious yet enriching because he did a whole lot for all 77. It wasn't 77 at the time, but for all the communities in our city.
So all Chicago City News followed everything that Harold did in his first term, and I was one of the reporters. So I was always at City Hall. I was always at city council meetings, and I followed him we followed a lot of issues. So Harold did given the fact that he had this incredible opposition in his first term, he was able to get 94%, I would say, of city business done. And in that first term, there's a picture of him with about 100 women, every single one of them who worked for the city and had a position of authority, a decision-making position of some sort. They were commissioners, they were deputy commissioners, they were his liaisons in the mayor's office. They were heads of boards and commissions that he was able to create at that point, although that was limited because of the 29 opposition. And I think that was a really good expression of some of the changes he made. From the day one, when he came into office, there were maybe 20 organizations that were community organizations that were getting funded through community development and other funds. I think by the end of his first term, it was over 250. So he was constantly changing what he could change and redefining how he was approaching stuff. Housing, city under Byrne, $3 of every city, $1 of private money was matched with $3 of city money for any of the projects they did, if I recall correctly. It was something like that ratio. Under Harold, in his first term, it was $3 of private money matched with $1 of city money in order to be able to, and expanding the amount of affordability that he was dealing with. So that we had a lot going on, and he inherited a lot of problems in a very, and he was really good at hiring people who were really good. That's what he was, one of the things that he excelled at. Not always perfect. We had some people that really didn't do such a great job, and they had to be replaced. But generally speaking, it was all a process of learning. Harold wasn't afraid to say, I made a mistake, or this isn't working, or maybe we should try another thing. So when I became alderman in the beginning of his second term, a lot of things were in process, but he was constantly under attack. And by then, he had control of the city council, but still, there was a lot to be done. And he had to negotiate. He had he had to negotiate with Dunn, for instance, and around political stuff. So they were negotiating for things that the city needed from the county, also at the time he died, all related to what was being called the potential dream ticket for the primaries in March. So there was lots going on, but working with him for me was a dream because I could see how it was hard, it was tough. I was under attack locally, which meant the local developer had hired a publicist who just was relentless. Affordable housing was not on the citywide agenda. It was not something that other aldermen even wanted to talk about. So I was really sort of forging new ground, and he was privately really supportive and told me that, and had committed that as soon as he got through through 1987, that in January he had a plan, and he already identified who was going to be working with me to do a whole series of things that we wanted to do around housing, all of which got killed literally within 24 hours of the time he died.
Part of Helen Shiller's legacy was creating adequate public housing in Chicago, and we asked her about her views on public housing here in the city now. This is good stuff. It's Helen Shiller on Randomly Selected.
So Harold was trying to make it work and he was trying to address a very bad situation. I mean, it was all planned failure. And he was working on a lot of that stuff, but and I remember I talk about this in my book. There's the first meeting I had with him. I had voted against something he was trying to do with CHA in committee, and I was explaining to him why. I was clearly going to vote for it on the floor, but I was explaining to him what my issues were, and it was a very complicated situation. And I understood why he was doing what he was doing. I had some issues with it. But that was ongoing because it was always difficult because, no one else really wanted any of this housing to survive, and the market folks were like waiting to jump on it. When Daley became mayor, he worked he didn't care about the stuff. Daley, actually, I have to acknowledge that he loved the city. That's what he really had in common with Harold. And he knew he had to deal with everyone. And from his own perspective, he tried to meet the bar that Harold had set in a number of areas. He just didn't understand what Harold's bar was versus how he saw it,
Right.
I don't think, in many circumstances. And he totally had a different point of view about the police and misconduct. But housing was a disaster because you really had to focus on it and pay attention and figure out some things differently, which Harold was intent on doing and was going to have, as I recall, he told me, Brenda Gaines, who at that point was the head of the Department of Housing, city's Department of Housing, was going to have Brenda focus on the bigger picture around housing come January. And of course, and she had the experience. She had worked in HUD and she was really smart and she knew this stuff. None of that really happened. So what would have happened, I think, would have been very different, even though the pressures were so great. And Daley's response was one that probably, at that point, I don't know what else could have been done, but I think a lot of things could have been done. We accepted a lot of changes. I mean, we don't have time to go into all the details. We accepted a lot of changes that I think we didn't need to accept.
There's never enough time when I'm...
So for instance, the people who were removed from housing to fix it, like the high rises on the lakefront,
Yeah.
I think who were promised return, if Harold had been alive longer and had stayed in office, I think they would have been able to return.
And it's kind of like what's happening now with Cabrini Green. Those people got promised everything and got nothing in return. And that probably would have been a different situation had Mayor Washington been able to implement.
Right. Unfortunately, and it was complicated because the die initially cast was the way on which all the buildings, not the original townhomes at Cabrini, but the later high-rises and the later high-rise, certainly Robert Taylor, that were built in a way that were not sustainable. So, of course, that wasn't going to survive.
You're the best. I appreciate you. I wish you would have ran for mayor.
No way.
What do you mean? You'd have been great at it. It would have been perfect.
Yeah, well.
I could have hung out with Brendan. Like, I'm going to the mayor's house. I appreciate you. What you've done for our city, we will never be able to repay you, and thank you enough for it. And thank you so much for being on Randomly Select.
Totally my pleasure. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you so much, Helen Shiller. One of my favorites, man. Totally appreciate you being on the show. And thank you so much for your insight and your wonderful words. Much appreciated. On the next Randomly Selected, we talk to one of the real ones, my man Shaka Rawls, principal of Leo Catholic here in the great city of Chicago. Be safe, everybody. Be well. See you soon. Peace.